My name is Oliver. I'm 27 years old. And if you had told me 10 years ago that I would one day inherit my grandfather's entire fortune, an astonishing $3.5 million, I would have just laughed in your face, completely unable to believe it. Back then, I wasn't even sure I would make it through the week, let alone the moment when I would sit in a lawyer's office while my own parents looked at me like vultures circling their prey. The irony of the situation was that these were the same parents who had erased me from their lives when I was 18. They had thrown me out onto the streets with nothing but a backpack and declared that I was no longer their problem. And now, here they were, suddenly appearing at the reading of the will, as if the past decade had never happened. My family had always been complicated. My mother and father were by no means poor. We lived in a nice house in a decent suburb. My father worked as a regional manager at a logistics company, and my mother was a part-time teacher who loved to act as if she ran the entire neighborhood. But they had one fatal flaw. External appearances meant everything to them. My older sister Claire was the golden child, an honor student, a cheerleader, the one who never caused them any trouble. For them, she could do no wrong. I, on the other hand, was the disappointment. I wasn't a rebel. Not exactly. I just didn't fit into their mold. I loved art more than football, books more than cars, and there was this stubborn streak in me that made me ask questions when they expected blind acceptance, and for them, that was unforgivable. The cracks started appearing in my teenage years. Every time money came up, it turned into a weapon. Claire got a brand new car for her 17th birthday, while I was told to be grateful for hand-me-down clothes. They fully paid for her college education, while I was told, if you want to go to college, you'll have to find the money yourself. And when I tried to resist, asking why I wasn't treated the same, I was lectured about how I needed to be a man and earn my place. My mom would roll her eyes and say something like, "Oliver, you've always been too sensitive. You expect the world to hand you everything." My dad would grumble that I'd never survive without them. I'll never forget that evening at dinner when my father leaned across the table, looked me straight in the eyes and said, "If you're still living under our roof by the time you're 18, you're a failure." I laughed back then, because what else could I do? But inside, I was crushed. When I turned 18, they didn't just kick me out, they made a spectacle of it. They sat me down, announced that they were cutting off financial support, and said, "It's time for you to learn the value of hard work." They gave me no money, no help, not even a hint of a safety net. I left that house with a backpack, a couple of changes of clothes, and a part-time job that barely covered food. That night, I slept in the back seat of my car. Meanwhile, Claire was posting pictures from her sorority house on Instagram, smiling with her brand new MacBook and Dad's credit card. The only one who didn't turn their back on me was my grandfather, my father's father. He was always different from the rest of them. Where my parents saw weakness, he saw potential. Where they mocked my quietness, he'd say, "Oh, that's because you think before you speak." He didn't care that I wasn't an athlete or the golden child. He saw me for who I truly was. He'd invite me to spend weekends with him, feed me, let me crash on his couch when things got really bad. I never told him everything my parents did, but he wasn't stupid. He saw the tension. He saw how I flinched when my father's name was mentioned. And over the years, he became more of a father to me than my real dad ever had. Almost 10 years passed. I built a modest life for myself. Not luxurious. I worked a lot, saved where I could, and stayed as far away from my family as possible. Claire would occasionally send smug messages about her vacations or new house, just to remind me that I was still beneath her. My parents stayed silent, unless, of course, they needed something from me. Then the sweet, syrupy voice of my mom would ring through. "Oliver, darling, how's everything going?" I knew better than to fall for that. I always kept my answers short. I wasn't about to be their backup plan. And then came that call I both feared and expected. My grandfather had passed away. It shattered me. Even though he'd been ill for some time, I'd convinced myself he'd pull through. Losing him felt like losing the only real family I'd ever had. When the lawyer called and said I had to be present for the reading of the will, I assumed I'd get maybe a watch or a letter, something sentimental. I never thought I'd inherit everything. When I walked into that wood-paneled office, I froze. There, dressed up as though for a gala, sat my parents and Claire. My mother had a wide smile. My father's hand rested smugly on his knee. Claire looked at me as though assessing how much I was worth now. I wanted to turn around and leave, but I forced myself to sit down. The air was thick with her fake sweetness. My mom leaned in and whispered, "Don't worry, Oliver. We'll make sure the inheritance is properly handled." My father added, "Yeah, of course. We'll manage it for you." They were already counting the money in their heads. I could see it in their eyes. They thought I was still that powerless kid they had thrown out. But then the lawyer cleared his throat, shuffled his papers, and said the words that made my heart race. According to the late Mr. Harold Montgomery's will, his entire estate, valued at approximately $3.5 million, is to go to his grandson, Oliver Montgomery. I swear, time stopped. I looked up, and for a split second, it felt like I saw my grandfather's smirk in my head, as if he had planned this moment all along. The smiles of my parents froze. Claire's jaw literally dropped. And then the lawyer flipped the page and said, "There are additional conditions you should hear." And that's when everything turned in a way none of us was prepared for. My mom was the first to recover from the shock, though her voice sounded too high-pitched and sweet, as if she was trying to hide her panic. "Well, of course, that makes sense," she said, lightly clapping her hands. "Oliver has always been so close to Dad. But, naturally, Oliver will need our guidance. He's inexperienced with finances. We'll step in, won't we, darling?" She turned to my father, and he nodded, as if everything was already decided. My father leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. Yes, Harold surely wanted the best. But Oliver's not ready to manage such an estate. $3.5 million is too much for someone with no background. It could ruin him. It makes sense for us to manage the funds on his behalf. The way he said ruin twisted my stomach. They didn't see me as a person. They saw me as an obstacle between them and the fortune. Claire smirked, tucking her hair behind her ear as though she could already picture herself shopping with that money. "Honestly, Oliver, no offense, but you were never, responsible. Remember how you maxed out that tiny credit limit in your freshman year?" She giggled quietly, as if that one mistake defined me forever. "And Dad's right. Sudden wealth could break you. Let us help." The lawyer cleared his throat again, cutting off their little performance. "If you'll allow me, Mr. Montgomery was very clear that the estate belongs solely to Oliver. No trustees, no oversight. Full control." His gaze flicked briefly to me, as though saying, "Your grandfather knew what they'd try to do." But that didn't stop my parents. My mom placed her hand on my arm, her nails digging into the sleeve. "Oliver, darling, you know we only want the best for you. We can guide you, save you from making mistakes. Think of it as a family effort. Your grandfather would want us all to benefit." That word benefit hung heavy in the room. They would benefit, not me. I stayed silent, trying to keep a neutral expression. But inside, I was boiling. All those years they'd told me I wasn't good enough. They'd pushed me aside for Claire. I had slept in my car while they laughed over vacation photos. And now they thought they could barge in and control the only thing my grandfather had left me. It wasn't about the money at that moment. It was about their arrogance, their assumption that I couldn't manage my own life without their guidance. When the lawyer finished, my mom quickly stood up, smoothing her skirt. "Well, thank you, Mr. Thompson. Oliver, we'll discuss the details of the house. You'll come over tonight, right?" She said it as though it was already arranged, like I would automatically return to their orbit. My father added, "Yes, we'll make a plan. Investments, property management, taxes. Don't worry, we'll take care of everything." And Claire, with that same smug smirk, leaned in as we were leaving. "You're lucky, Oliver. If it weren't for us, you'd drown in all of this. Don't forget who really knows what they're doing." I gritted my teeth, my fists clenched at my sides. Lucky? No. I was chosen. My grandfather saw through them all and decided to put everything into my hands. And no matter how hard they tried to pretend otherwise, they no longer controlled the situation. But I didn't say a word. Not yet. Because I knew deep down that this was only the beginning. I walked out of that law office that day with my head spinning. My grandfather's will clutched in my hands like a lifeline. My parents walked out with fragile smiles, The kind you wear when you swallow disappointment, but I felt their eyes burning into my back. I knew them well enough to understand. This wasn't the end of their schemes. It was only the beginning. And I was right. That same evening, around 9 o'clock, there was a knock on my door. When I opened it, standing on my doorstep was Claire, looking as if she had just stepped off a runway, her perfume lingering in the air. She gave me that same smirk and slipped past me without asking. "Cute little apartment," she said, eyeing my tiny living room with exaggerated raised brows. "But let's be honest, Oliver, this won't do anymore. You'll need something grander. And guess who can help with that? Me." I slowly closed the door, already feeling exhausted. "What do you want, Claire?" She flopped onto my couch as if it were hers, crossing her legs. "Simple. I'm here to make sure you don't embarrass yourself with this inheritance." Part 2. Betrayal and Quiet Resurrection. That visit from Claire hung in the air of my modest apartment like a heavy, poisonous cloud. She lounged on my couch, looking down at me with the hauteur of her imagined superiority. "You've been living so small, Oliver, that you don't even realize what you have in your hands." Her voice was sweet, like spoiled honey. "Think about it. Dad is good with investments. Mom knows all the right people. And me," she playfully twirled a lock of her hair around her finger, "I know a thing or two about style. Imagine how the three of us can help you. We'll turn Grandpa's inheritance into something truly big. But only if you stop being so stubborn." Her words stung, not because they held any truth, but because they were an exact echo of all the insults I'd heard from my parents over the years. Small-minded, stubborn, incompetent. She had memorized this role by heart. "I don't need your help," I said firmly. "Grandpa left everything to me. Not to you, not to them, to me." Her smile faltered, but she quickly covered it with a condescending chuckle. "Oh, Oliver, you really think that? You think Grandpa didn't expect you to lean on the family? You wouldn't have even met with that lawyer if Mom hadn't told you the time of the appointment." That's when it hit me. She wasn't here to help. She was here to test me, to see if I would give in, to see if I would break. But the real betrayal came a week later. The phone call came like thunder on a clear day. The lawyer's voice was dry and official. "Oliver, I need to ask. Did you authorize any changes to the inheritance accounts?" I froze. "No. What's going on?" "There were attempts to access the funds. Someone came to the bank, posing as your representative. Fortunately, the bank blocked the transaction due to the will's conditions. But these people were very persistent. They claimed you gave them verbal permission." I knew immediately who it was. My parents. That night, I got in my car and drove to their house. It looked exactly as I remembered. 2 cars in the driveway, the cozy porch light casting its glow, the picture of suburban comfort. I sat in the dark, gripping the wheel, staring at the house I had once been kicked out of. And for the first time, I didn't feel sadness or longing. I felt cold, calculated rage. Because this wasn't just manipulation anymore. This was theft. They were willing to break the law, forge documents, lie, anything to take what Grandpa had entrusted to me. And then, as if the universe wanted to twist the knife deeper, I got a message from Claire. "Don't be naive, Oliver. The money needs to be in the hands of those who know how to handle it. Be smart or you'll lose everything." I stared at those words, feeling my heart pound in my chest. This was the moment when something inside me snapped. The betrayal wasn't just in their attempt to steal. It was in the realization that they would never see me as anything other than the weak link, the disposable thing they could throw away. They had kicked me out when I was 18, laughed while I barely made ends meet, and now, when I finally had something of my own, they wanted to take that too. I put my phone down and sat in the dark, thinking of Grandpa. I remembered his voice, firm and calm, the way he would look at me and say, "Oh, don't let anyone decide your worth. You decide that yourself." For years I hadn't believed him. But now, with my parents circling like sharks, I finally understood. That night became a point of no return. I was never going to let them manipulate me again. And I wasn't just going to protect what was mine. I was going to make them regret ever underestimating me. But I had no idea how far they would go next or how dirty this war would get. The days following the bank incident were some of the darkest since the night I was kicked out. At first, I thought I could just ignore their schemes, cut them out of my life, and move on. But they didn't work like that. They knew how to worm their way into every crack, to squeeze into places they didn't belong, until you started suffocating. I began to notice strange things. One morning, I went down to my car and found a deep scratch running along the entire side. It wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, jagged, as if someone had taken a key from the front bumper to the back taillight. Later that week, I received an email from my landlord. He had received several anonymous complaints about noise coming from my apartment. I lived alone. I barely played music, and often worked late. It was obvious someone was trying to cause trouble for me. Then came the whispers. My parents still lived in the same town I had grown up in, and they had their circle. Country club visitors, churchgoers, neighbors who thrived on gossip. Suddenly, these people started looking at me differently when I ran errands. The cashier at the grocery store, who usually smiled, now raised her eyebrows when I paid in cash. The woman at the gas station muttered, "Must be nice to live on the old man's money." I knew where it was coming from. My parents had begun portraying me as a greedy, unworthy grandson who had barged in and stolen the family fortune. The worst part wasn't even the slander. The worst part was the silence. The few friends I had left in town stopped calling. They'd heard the rumors, and maybe some of them believed them. I'd worked so hard to build a reputation as someone reliable, someone you could trust, and now my parents were destroying all of that. I hit rock bottom one night, sitting alone at the kitchen table, staring at a pile of bills. Not because I couldn't pay them, I had access to the money now, but because I was terrified. Terrified that if I started openly spending Grandpa's money, it would play into the narrative my parents were weaving. Terrified that every move I made would be twisted into proof that I couldn't handle what I had been given. And that's when old doubts started creeping back. Maybe they were right. Maybe I wasn't strong enough. Maybe I would drown in this inheritance like they had predicted. For hours I sat there, reliving every insult, every humiliation, every memory of being told I was worthless. It was as if I were 18 again, sleeping in the back seat of my car, wondering if I'd make it to the next week. But then I opened the drawer, and inside was something I had almost forgotten about. The envelope Grandpa had given me on my 21st birthday. I had kept it all these years, never looking inside. Inside was a letter, written in his firm, slightly trembling handwriting. "Oliver, if you're reading this, I hope you've already figured out that the world doesn't give you anything easily. It tries to take everything from you. Don't let it. You're stronger than you think, and one day, you'll have to prove it. When that time comes, don't back down. Stand tall. They can only take from you if you give it to them." I read those words over and over until they burned into me. My grandfather had known. He had seen through my parents long before I did, and he had trusted me to rise above it all. That night, something inside me clicked. I was still at rock bottom, alone, battered, defeated, but I started quietly, carefully planning. I began documenting everything. I kept copies of the bank's report on the attempted access. I saved Claire's text messages. I wrote down every piece of gossip I heard in town, and where it came from. At work, I started staying late, using public computers to study inheritance law, trusts, property management. If they wanted to treat me like I was incompetent, I was going to become the most capable person in the room. I told no one what I was doing. I smiled when people mocked me, kept calm when my parents threw barbed remarks, and acted like I was giving in. All the while, I was quietly building something beneath the surface. It was lonely and painful. Every day felt like walking a tightrope over an abyss. But in that silence, there was a strange strength. For the first time, I didn't react. I was preparing. And I had a distinct, unwavering sense that Grandpa would be proud of me. I didn't know when or how, but I swore to myself that the day would come when the balance of power would shift, when I would no longer be the target, but the one pulling the strings. I just didn't realize how quickly that opportunity would present itself, or how ruthlessly my parents would try to force my hand. The shift didn't happen overnight, but once it started, it seemed unstoppable, like the tide finally turning in my favor after years of fighting against the current. I kept my head down, worked long hours, and immersed myself in learning everything I could about responsible wealth management. It wasn't really about the money. Not really. It was about proving to myself that I wasn't the helpless child my parents had always portrayed me as. The first real turning point came when I hired a financial advisor, not some flashy person connected. Part 3. Judgment and Retribution. That worn leather notebook lay on my lap like a sacred artifact. My fingers trembled as I flipped through the pages, filled with the firm, slightly shaky handwriting of my grandfather. These were not just notes. They were reflections, observations, and most importantly, a detailed plan for the day his worst fears about my father and mother came true. On the last pages, he had laid out with surgical precision how to counter every possible move they might make. Attempts to gain power of attorney, pressure through the bank, manipulation through guilt, public defamation. He knew them inside and out. He studied their strategy even before they conceived it themselves. He didn't just leave me money, he left me a strategic guide for waging war. And he left me his most loyal general, Daniel. Closing the notebook, I felt with bone-deep certainty the time to merely survive was over. I was no longer going to just defend what was mine. I was going to prepare the ground so that when my parents inevitably made their next move, I would be ready to crush it completely. They wanted to play games with me. They had no idea I was already holding the winning card. The boiling point came faster than I expected. My parents circled for months, sending letters, dropping hints through neighbors, making not-so-subtle insinuations whenever our paths crossed in town. But when they finally made their move, they crossed every line. Too far. One crisp autumn morning, Daniel called me. His voice was calm, but there was an edge I had never heard before. "Oliver, your parents filed a petition this morning. They are demanding you be declared incapable of managing the inheritance and want to appoint themselves as guardians of the assets." Guardianship. They really tried to declare me incompetent. At 27. After everything I had built with my own hands, I almost laughed when he told me. The absurdity was almost overwhelming. But then came the burning realization. This was not just another behind-closed-doors manipulation attempt. This was public. It was them dragging my name through the mud, trying to brand me incapable in front of the entire community. And that was their mistake. Daniel and I had been preparing for months, quietly gathering every scrap of evidence of their interference. Attempts to access the bank account, manipulative letters, rumors they spread, and the most crushing blow, the ironclad terms of the will that my grandfather had drafted with surgical precision. Piece by piece, we built a case so airtight it practically glowed. The court date was set for a gray Tuesday. I entered the courtroom in a simple suit, without entourage, without theatrics. My parents were already seated, flanking Claire like loyal soldiers. They looked smug, confident, as if the outcome was already decided. My mother even had the audacity to smile at me, her expression sweet, syrupy, as if forgiving me for forcing this spectacle. But when the judge called us to order and my parents' lawyer began his opening statement, cracks appeared immediately. He painted me as irresponsible, emotionally unstable, prone to financial recklessness. He cited my lack of experience and modest background. Claire nodded dramatically at every point, playing her role to perfection. Then it was our turn. Daniel rose slowly, his presence commanding without needing to raise his voice. "Your Honor, what we have here is not a question of competence, but a question of greed," he began. And he started presenting documents one by one. The forged attempt at the bank, letters offering control, text messages dripping with condescension, the will's provisions that explicitly disinherited my parents if they tried to interfere. The courtroom grew silent with every new piece of evidence. My parents fidgeted in their seats, their smugness melting away. Claire's jaw clenched, her arms crossed over her chest. Then came the final, crushing blow. Daniel raised that very leather notebook of my grandfather's. Mr. Montgomery anticipated this very situation. His own handwritten notes describe his concerns about the manipulative history of his son and daughter-in-law. He wrote, and I quote, "If they try to take what is not theirs, that will be sufficient evidence why I chose Oliver." Those words struck the courtroom like a hammer blow. I saw my mother's face go pale, my father's fists clench, Claire's eyes stare at the floor. When the judge finally spoke, her tone was crisp and final. The petition is denied. The estate remains under the sole control of Oliver Montgomery. Furthermore, the court warns the petitioners against any further attempts to undermine the clearly expressed will of the deceased. This case is closed. It was over in less than an hour, but the consequences were immediate. My parents' attempt to seize control not only failed, they publicly exposed them for what they truly were: manipulative, greedy, desperate. Leaving the courtroom, my mother tried one last time. She extended her hand, her voice trembling with false warmth. "Oliver, dear, we only did this for you. You don't understand the pressure. Give us—" I stopped and looked at her with a calmness I had never felt in my life. "No," I said simply. "You did it for yourselves. Grandpa knew it, and now everyone else knows too." Her hand froze in midair before dropping to her side. Father muttered something under his breath but couldn't even meet my eyes. Claire marched forward, her heels clicking on the marble floor like gunshots. I walked out of that courthouse feeling years of weight lifted from my shoulders. I hadn't just defended my grandfather's trust, I had done it with a calm they never expected from me. They underestimated me at every turn, and in the end, their own arrogance undid them. But this was only the beginning of their reckoning. Because while the courtroom settled the legal battle, the real consequences, social, personal, irreversible, still awaited, just around the corner. The weeks after the trial were like dominoes falling in slow motion, one after another. My parents entered that courtroom believing they would win, believing they could bend the world the same way they bent me when I was young. But the judge's ruling did more than just dismiss their petition. It shattered the illusion they had built for decades. And as the mask slipped away, the whole town began to see them differently. It started small. My mother's circle at the country club, those she had gossiped with for years, began to distance themselves. Where she once was the center of attention, conversations now hushed when she entered the room. One woman even quietly told me, "We didn't know how badly they treated you, Oliver. I'm sorry." Mom tried to keep up appearances, but the icy smiles and muted whispers told me her reputation was collapsing. Things were no better for my father. His workplace heard about the hearing. In small towns, stories seep into every corner. Suddenly, his financial expertise was no longer an asset. Clients became wary. Meetings were canceled. Rumors eventually spread that he was offered early retirement. For a man whose identity was entirely tied to his career, the humiliation was devastating. And Claire. Oh, Claire. Her fall was the steepest. She built her social status on being the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, the one who mocked me while being showered with gifts. But after the hearing, people saw her differently. At parties, she was no longer the center of attention, just the girl who tried to steal from her own brother and failed. Her boyfriend left her soon after, and according to rumors I heard, she moved back in with our parents. All three under one roof again, feeding off each other's bitterness like slow poison. Meanwhile, my own life expanded in ways I could never have imagined. The estate was not just money, it was opportunity. I invested in myself, in projects my grandfather would have been proud of. The board of the charitable foundation grew into something bigger, and I found myself stepping into leadership roles where my voice mattered. For the first time in my life, I was not an outsider. I was not a disappointment. I was a man respected. But the most powerful moment came one evening as I drove past my parents' house. The very house I was thrown out of at 18 with nothing but a backpack. The porch light was on, but the lawn was unkempt. The shutters needed painting. The house looked tired, dilapidated, almost like the people inside it. I parked across the street and watched for a while. Memories surged over me. The night of my exile, years of mockery, endless comparisons to Claire. For so long, that place embodied my failure, my shame. But now, looking at it, I felt nothing but clarity. They didn't destroy me. They forged me. Every insult, every humiliation, every cruel word built the resolve I now carried. And then I realized that the revenge was complete, not because I humiliated them in court, not because they lost their standing, but because I no longer needed their approval. Their power over me was gone entirely. I rolled down the window, letting in the cool night air, and whispered words I had never dared say before. Grandpa was right. I decide what I'm worth. And with that, I shifted into gear and drove away, leaving the house and everything it stood for behind. They tried to cut me out of their lives. In the end, it was I who cut them out of mine.